This is the first half of the Building Empires duology of lectures, and then this one is focusing in on the Phoenicians as sort of the counterpart to the Assyrians and their methods of empire, and in this case it's the empire of trade, is the vision that they have of how to build an empire. Like in this case, more of a loose confederation of cities. Same kind of thing as when we talked about the Assyrians, imperial goals. What do you want out of an empire? First thing, of course, is control of trade. So you want control of those trade routes. And unlike the Assyrians, for the Phoenicians, those trade routes that are most important are trade routes that go by water. For the Assyrians, the Neo-Assyrians focused on trade routes on land. The Phoenicians focused on trade routes on water. They want to expand and grow. And finally, they want access to materials, access to resources to create goods for trade, to have places to trade, and to manufacture the goods that are very valuable for their trade. And so the question becomes, how do you achieve those imperial goals? Same goals, different ways of getting there. In the Phoenician trading empire, between 1200 and 500 BCE, you'll notice this lasted about 700 years, at least 300 or 400 longer than the Neo-Assyrians. And you'll also notice as we look at this, it's not an empire in the same sense as when we talked about with the Neo-Assyrians, where there's conquest, a central government that everybody has to obey. Instead, when we talk about the Phoenician Empire, we're really talking about is the Phoenician cities and their city colonies that spread around the Mediterranean. So they're politically mostly independent, but they're culturally shared. It's that city-state way of life. They share a common culture. They often act as allies. They often share with each other in trade. And so it's that mixture of independence and yet having a central culture or other kinds of trade contacts that bring them together. So these are the city-states. Like we talked about before in here, they're mostly independent, they're linked by trade, and the colony that's going to end up becoming most influential, even more so than the city in Phoenicia itself, is Carthage in North Africa, and that's going to become the most powerful of the Phoenician city-state colonies, and it's going to become the leader of those cities. For the Phoenicians, in terms of their expansion of the Mediterranean, they're really pushed out in a lot of ways. The land that they are in has been invaded. They're in the land of Canaan, and so the Israelites show up and the Armenians show up, and they're getting really shoved out of the way, basically. They have problems with overpopulation as they're shoved into a smaller area and their population continues to grow. And more than anything, the Phoenicians are first and foremost traders, and so expanding, the hope is that'll give you new sources of trade goods, but also new people who will buy your trade goods. So new markets to sell your trade goods in. One of the things we know the Phoenicians for is this is the beginning of the alphabet we use today in the Phoenician writings. It was made up of consonants only, by the way. It didn't include any vowels, which you were supposed to be able to guess from the other letters in the word. So you might actually think of it as text, almost like modern text messaging, just sort of indicating the shape of the word by only using the consonants, not the vowels there. The great irony of this is that we have almost no surviving writings by the Phoenicians. A good portion of this is probably because the Phoenicians wrote on papyrus and they lived next to the sea. So between occasional fires, the damp living conditions of the sea-like areas, that probably just destroyed over time all the records. So they are the first alphabet, and we just basically have none of the records that we knew they kept. The Phoenicians were first and foremost traders and manufacturers. And long-distance trade for people of this time usually has to be relatively small objects, things that can travel long distances, and things that have the opportunity for a high amount of profit. So basically what you're looking for ideally is something that is stable, it's not going to rot, it's going to be able to travel a long distance, it's small enough that you can put a lot of them on your boat, your ship, to get it from one place to another, and you're going to be handsomely rewarded when you get it to the market in the end. For the Phoenicians, one of their critical things is the murex snail. It's this little snail that you crush its shell and you can make this very, very bright scarlet dye that was highly prized. And so that's one of their big things. Cedars from Lebanon is another one. Papyrus from Egypt, other kinds of luxury goods coming from both the Phoenician colonies and cities themselves, but also from the surrounding areas that they bring in for trade. Carthage is the leader of the Phoenician triangle. In this case, when they refer to the Phoenician triangle, what they're referring to is the city-states that are in between, basically in between North Africa, Spain, and then the Italian islands like Sicily. And so that makes up a triangle, and in that triangle, Carthage is basically in charge of the Phoenicians and has a really heavy grip on all the trade that takes place in those areas. What you're looking at in the picture is actually a reconstruction of what they think the city might have looked like using computers. And so this is supposed to give you an idea of what it might have been like to visit Carthage. And if you look at it with the various buildings that probably housed apartments, you have shops. Down in the water, what you're looking at there that's the harbor where they keep the warships, the navy that defends Carthage and Carthaginian ships from attack. And in fact, Carthage enforced a trade monopoly using their very powerful, very swift, very effective navy. And so if you want to trade in the area that's part of that Phoenician triangle, that's dominated by the ships themselves, in that area, you are either going to have to pay extra taxes to allow your ship to continue on its way, or you might actually have your ship and your goods seized and taken back to Carthage. So they're very clear that their goal is to dominate trade and basically keep outsiders out of it. Once again, what you're looking at here close up now is where the Navy ships were kept. And you'll notice, like most of Mediterranean shipping at this point in time, I don't know if you can see it, but on the far right, that's a rowing ship. And so that's what often happened to slaves, the very poor who couldn't pay off their debts. They end up as slaves working in these rowing ships, basically chained to benches. The thing that makes the Phoenician cities different, and the one that we know the most about is Carthage, is that the basic principle is of rule by wealth. It's technically what is called an oligarchy, and an oligarchy means that you're dealing with the people who are the elite of society, and those are the ones who are at the top commercially, and by becoming at the top commercially, they are given seats to be representatives in the government. Okay, oligarchy means it's basically government by committee rather than by a particular individual. So the goal is to build, to build up your family's fortune, and if you build up your family's fortune high enough, you too can find a place in the Senate and the inner circles of government. Religion. As far as we can tell, for the Carthaginians, religion was tied to the various natural forces, the gods and goddesses, but we really don't have a clear understanding of it, which is probably partly due to the fact that we don't have the written records very much. The thing that Carthage was known for by people like the Romans was child sacrifice. It's not really clear what's going on. They have found what this is called the Tophet. It's a burial ground where children were buried, and there's been some argument about whether these children were being deliberately sacrificed, or if instead this is simply a place to bury children who died of natural causes. And it is worth it, but that's the possibility, and that's definitely the image that people tend to have of the Carthaginians at the time. By the way, this sacrifice was usually probably performed by the family, and it started with the elite. So the first children were sacrificed, and those were probably the children of the elite themselves. The idea being in this case that you're giving up to the gods the most valuable thing you have, and hoping in exchange for that they will help you in your time of need. Another thing that's interesting about the Phoenician city-states is they were ethnically open as far as we can tell. So if you were visiting Carthage, you might well come across people from sub-Saharan Africa. You might come across people from Spain, people from what's now France, from Cornwall in England, as well as people who are Phoenician by descent, Canaanite by descent, any of the food that would help you. Okay. Like the Assyrians, the Phoenicians were ethnically open. They basically structured power based on economic success. So if you moved to Carthage and brought your family with you, and you were able to make a living and do quite well as a merchant, your family could maybe gain eventually a position on the Senate. On the other hand, if you're a wealthy Carthaginian family, but the new family head makes some really disastrous mistakes and you lose everything, you lose your seat in the Senate. So ultimately what matters more is your wealth, not your ethnicity. So these are two models of empire that we're left with, the Phoenician versus the Assyrian. The Assyrians focusing on land, the Phoenicians focusing on sea, both trying to control trade, both seeing a different type of trade as the key one to control. And we also see another major difference, which is the Assyrians are based on conquest, the idea of pulling people together, creating a centralized government, versus the concept that instead you can have this whole collection of city-states simply united by cultural traditions. King versus oligarchy. Do you need a central ruler in charge, or can rule basically be by committee of the wealthiest people in the city? And then finally, do you want to maintain a closely tightened centralized government, or do you want to give the individual city-states a lot more freedom to do as they wish? And then the question is, which of these do you find most successful? And in order to figure that out, you probably will have to think about, how do you define success? Is it by how long the empire lasted? Is it by the amount of wealth that was accumulated during the empire? Is it by people's reactions to it? Whether or not it stimulated a lot of rebellion? Or finally, of course, did it create violence? Did getting it include violence?